Hello and welcome back to the One Rule Church podcast. I'm Cara. I'm here with Cherie and Leah, and today we are tackling the topic of sexism, power, and pleasure. Now, this is not my wheelhouse. I cannot speak for Cherie, but it is not mine. Leah is our resident. I know she kind of shies away from the term expert, but she is our resident expert on this topic area. She is extremely well versed from an experiential and educational or academic standpoint. And so we are thankful to have her to kind of take the lead on this discussion today. And so, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Miss Leah Deshay.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I was in the chat, so I want to make sure I don't do anything funny. You all know how I am with my fingers when I'm on this podcast. Fat fingers in the works. So my name is Leah Deshay. I am a maternal child health provider / specialist. I am also a newer sociologist when it comes to reproductive sociology specifically. And for the last 14 years, I have been working in reproductive and it used to be called women's health, but femme health, anybody who lives their life as a femme. That is definitely my wheelhouse. So I started off my career actually working on the trajectory of sexually transmitted disease in high-risk, sexually fluid people of color. And that was here in the United States and in South Africa, which is very, very different cultures. And then I moved into the effects of all of those variables as it pertains to childbearing, like regardless of whether or not it was intentional. Just any time the potential for childbearing was involved. So that was HIV and HCV research with all of those specificities. And you would think that wouldn't be a lot of people, but it's actually quite a lot of people. Anytime you have sex work or drug addiction involved and there's anybody who has a uterus, then they would fit into all of those categories. And that revolutionized my life. And then the second thing that changed my life was deciding to become a mother, which was not something I had planned on doing until not at that time, until I got pregnant with my firstborn and bore her, which was 10 years ago now this year. And ever since then, my whole life has revolved around the topics of immunology, virology, sexuality, and bearing or not bearing children, as it would be. So I'm very interested in this. So as I've gotten further along in my career and done various things, everything from teaching at the collegiate level to practicing in clinic and the hospital, my heart is really still in research. So that's why I'm back in grad school now, and I'm interested in the larger questions. I'm interested in collective behavioral patterns and like the social dynamics that create the patterns that we see across populations as it pertains to sex and immunity and childbearing. So that's me. That's my nutshell. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not good at doing my biography. So I don't know if there's anything else I should say about that. Did I leave anything out?
I don't think so. I think that covers the important stuff, if nothing else.
So the first thing we're going to break down is definition of power and sexuality as it pertains to colonial context. So I struggle with all of these, like not because they're actually difficult for me, but because making them concise and general, I think, is difficult. Or I find it difficult. This first one, people have written volumes of books on it and many dissertations, not even my own, but that I hold very dear because I've studied. I think the most general sense to to review this dynamic is that the majority of sex slave trade, so like speaking very specifically to ADOS, African descendants of slaves, right? Like in the Americas specifically. Not because the rest of the colonial effects are not important. I'm just being specific, like for the sake of brevity, because the interactions are different across populations. But the definition of power and sexuality and their interactions for those of us who are Black in the United States are really that, you know, the abuse of power, specifically exploiting Black women sexually, is what allowed slavery to be propagated in the United States. And the reason why I think that one sentence as a concept is really integral to this idea and this conversation is because it is one that the church, and specifically the Black church, goes out of its way to ignore. And I find that like personally offensive, right? Like, the reason why I say that is because, you know, slave trade stopped. It became quote unquote illegal in the sense of the actual movement of kidnapped African persons from one continent to another in the beginning of the 1800s. By the start of the French and Indian War, when British descendants, British rebels, really were trying to take over the Louisiana Territory, which was all basically everything west of the Mississippi at that time, and the Spanish quote unquote territories that they were all living on. You were no longer technically allowed to kidnap and transport any African people and drop them off in the United States. It just wasn't legal. And so, like, logically, you would think, oh, so then that was it. Like, that generation was the end, right? Like, nobody made it past 1820. Because at that point, all the slaves have died? No, of course not. Slavery was propagated for a whole nother half of a century on the sheer fact that every single descendant of slave trade who was present was raped and bred. Like, there's no sensitive way to discuss this. Like, that's what was happening. And so for conversations like this, I am personally affronted, and like I feel very aggressively defensive about the fact that the Black church in particular is so adamant about ignoring this fact. You can't get at the heart of any of the sexism, and certainly not the oppression and suffocation of pleasure as a concept, especially as a liberating concept for Black women, without addressing how and why those of us who are ADOS in the United States are even here in the first place. Like, that's why. Like, and you can say, oh, but there were Black people who got married on the plantation. They quote unquote got married. They jumped the broom. But you know how they got married? With the express allowance of whoever the hell was holding them hostage. There were no consensual relationships of any kind for Black women that were allowed to be publicly supported. That's a really uncomfortable, like extremely upsetting fact for most of us to deal with. And I think even we don't understand the degree to which reductionist history has romanticized so many things in slavery. That's one of them. You didn't get to choose your spouse. It didn't like, oh, they got married to Black men. Yeah, but do you really think that they were looking at Black love, and for even if for a glimmer they saw any Black woman that was having any pleasure, that they were like, oh yeah, of course you can marry him? No, everything that happened on those plantations was by design. Everything. Nothing that was going to contribute to your mind, body, or spirit being liberated, God forbid, comforted, was ever going to be allowed. And this idea of sexual abuse being quote unquote like embedded in the culture, it was not embedded, it was suffocated. We were drowned in it. Everybody was required, or else you literally died. And you know, they would beat people to death on the plantations and make everybody watch. Like, this is really violent and it's terrible to hear somebody, but I think it's important because, again, it's either been romanticized, at this point in our ancestry, we're so far removed from it that I think it's kind of easy to suggest to ourselves that it didn't happen, but that is not true at all. It was actually the only way that slavery could be maintained was by trying to normalize levels of dehumanization and monstrosity that most of us cannot even imagine. And it was not the exception, it was the rule. So as Black women, the very, very heart, the core, the grinding stone in the middle of that machine was the capacity to suffocate, completely suffocate any sort of voluntary expression of our bodies at all, for anything, for spiritual use, for sexual use, for social use. It didn't matter. You can breathe, eat, sleep, or think about what you were going to do with any man, a Black one or a white one, unless it involved the expressed strategic approval of whoever it was who was oppressing you. Do you know what I mean? And so, like, that is at the foundation of what most of us. Oh, that's a Judah. I don't get to see him much other than your pictures. Babies always distract me. I will always get off track with the baby, unless it's mine. That's different. They have to get out. Other people's babies are different. Yeah, but no, I think, and that gets into, yes, that covers the next section, which is the introduction of differences between sexual race dynamics in the U.S. with Black women versus colonized men. I mean, that could be its own whole broadcast, because Black men were also not exempt in any way, shape, or form to like sexual abuse or assault or anything, But the difference is theirs did not yield offspring that they were forced to like raise. And that doesn't make it any less traumatic for them. But now we know without a shadow of a doubt, because of the extraordinary lengths and progress that we have made with genetics, we know about the existence of epigenetics, and there's certain very specific markers that we and Indigenous women have in this country that it was genetic adaptation and it allowed us to survive, but like at a cost, as you might imagine, right? The things that you need to do in order to survive in humane conditions are specifically for short-term survival, but in the long term, they can perpetuate the effects of trauma that you might not have even been present for, right? And that is amazing. Like, to me, it's a sort of reverent, awe-inspiring, and also slightly like disconcerting concept. It's just complex. We know that epigenetics work in the other direction as well in terms of resilience, but the idea that it just goes to reinforce on every level, like, we're still dealing with social effects of trauma that our entire population was very intentionally, submerged in. But there are also things that we pass down to each other, specifically in our health. Like, we're talking about it on like a mitochondrial level, like the way that our bodies respond to stress genetically is not the same as populations that have not been through the strain that we went through for generations. And that happened specifically so that we could survive being bombarded by people trying to kill us every day. Like, it was a necessity, but it's very much like a necessity that was born out of evil, obviously not our own. So I think that covers the first half. I want to take a breath here because that's a lot of heavy stuff, and hear you guys' reactions. And I know, like, this is not things that we don't know, but it's something different when you're in a place where you're diving into it, talking about it.
No, I actually think, especially the part about like us not like it all being romanticized, right? Like, I feel like
Yeah, we need
it's
to remember we
heavy
didn't get to
because,
choose our Black
yeah,
partners either. It's
right.
really important to point that
Yeah.
out.
This is not, it's heavy because we don't get the just like very hardcore raw truth. And there's a reason for that,
It's real.
because if we, dig into the brutality of what the experience has been, and not only what, our ancestors experienced, but as you were talking about, Leah, how it's been transitioned, not just, culturally, but even genetically. Like, like there's so many layers to
That's
all of
so
this
heavy.
that
Like
we
when
don't.
so heavy.
It's extremely layered, and it's so easy to take it for granted when it's not like fully in your face, and especially because we're talking about women's experiences specifically, and how our experiences differ from those of men. And that's not to diminish what men have been through, and the fact that black men have the history of being black in America as well. But the way that that was manifested in the experience of being a woman versus the way it was manifested in the experience of being a man, it is different. And dealing with that, like I think just kind of coming to terms, because we're going to talk about colorism too, but coming to terms with the realities of you being able to be an oppressed person and having all of the baggage, the layers and layers of baggage that comes with that, and still being situated differently than people who, you know, had even more layers of baggage because of, other factors beyond anyone's control. And it doesn't take, I think for me, it's just like making me, even just in the context of this discussion, like I have to be really intentional about thinking about that, because it is something, that can kind of get thrown by the wayside in the midst of like what we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. But you really have to unpack, have these conversations and unpack this information with like a super intentional and keen awareness that you can be both oppressed and still not have even tapped into the deeper levels of oppression that other people have gone through. And it doesn't take away from what you've been through, but all of that needs to be considered, when we're having these conversations. And if you're not considering it, then you do not only the conversation to just an injustice or a disservice, but you, I think, kind of set yourself up to not really being able to understand, what people who are not you are up against. And I think if we're because eventually I think we're going to get to like overcoming and how we move forward. But I think, if we're not being intentional about those things moving forward, it's difficult, because you can't unify with someone who's not willing to acknowledge, the reality of what your experience has been. And so to move forward collectively, like we have to be intentional about how we're thinking about having these conversations. And so for me personally, I really appreciate you, kind of laying that foundation, because it's so layered. And you have to be wrapping your mind around that as we're talking about it. So I think that that's really good.
I'm glad. I'm looking through the comments right now, and somebody, I believe it's man, it's a stereotypically male name, so correct me if I'm wrong, but Jerome said, "Woo, this is heavy," and I'm like, yeah, we probably should have put a trigger warning, perhaps. So significant apologies for that. I mean, I don't know. I feel like when you put up conversations, you're like, this is about sexuality and racism. Like, does it need a trigger warning? You should know where it's going. But I could be wrong. That's me. That's my bias. I live in this world. So we will try to be more intentional. I will make sure I try to bring it up to Car, because I know I didn't think about it, and that's my bad.
Yes,
Cherie,
I
what
will
were you
add it. I will
saying?
add a trigger warning.
Cherie, what were you saying?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think a lot of times things, no disrespect, also, a lot of times things feel heavy, but you have to understand this is the weight that we carry, you know, and we have to discuss the heaviness, because yes, it's heavy, but it's on every shoulder of every indigenous woman. It's on our shoulders, whether we want it on our shoulders or not. It's placed upon our shoulders when we're born. You know what I mean? No one chooses to have this as our lineage or as our history. No one chooses this, but it's a part of it. And a lot of times there are things that are created in ideologies that are established based off of this, and we don't even understand why things are the way that they are if we're not willing to talk about how they got there, why they got there. We want to gloss over those things. So I definitely think that I know that I am a person, I believe in truth and love. I believe in telling the truth at all times, because that then and only then can you find the love in the lesson, in the light in any situation, is by exposing the darkness in it. And so you have to bring that to the surface. There's no way to do anything without doing that. Anything that you do without um, bringing that to the surface is going to be backhanded and fleeting. You know what I mean? It's not going to last. So you have to bring it out so that way all the truth can come out. People can really discuss how they feel about it, and you can actually get somewhere. You can't get anywhere with half doing anything. It's kind of, no disrespect, but it's kind of how this podcast started. You know what I mean? There was a situation that happened and it was half truths, and we had to bring the full truth to the table. So that's something that we're committed to doing over here. So, I just kind of wanted to give that information to our listeners too. While sometimes it's going to be heavy, we promise that it's always going to be necessary. So that's what I have to say.
We're leaning into discomfort instead of running away from it. That's
Yes, yes, yes.
yes.
That is a very good characterization. Okay. So if anybody has questions, please ask me. I'm kind of like in my instructor mode right now. And so pardon me, because that's also like not the most interesting way to interact with people on air. So if you have questions, just stop me. Like, this is not, I could talk about this literally all day and all night for the next year. So please ask your questions. That way I'm talking about things that are relevant. Anybody have any other thoughts before I move into the next part, which is colorism and caste? And that's something.
I guess we can talk about how the power structure when it comes to sexuality and colonialism still affects us now today.
You mean as it relates to colorism, or in addition to that? All that.
In addition to the first point.
Okay. Yes. So, I should also reveal, well, I mean, I don't think that this is like special information about me because I do this kind of stuff all the time. But so I'm a bookworm. I'm a book addict. And I'm on this quest this year that I will read at least one, although right now I'm at about 2 books by Black femme authors that I've never touched or heard of in my life before. And so I read books that I want to recommend to people who are really interested in like the historical facts about this. One is called They Were Her Property. That is very important. I'm going to get into that at the end of this. We were supposed to on Clubhouse yesterday. My Clubhouse is acting up, talking about who contributes to or perpetuates more stress in Black women's daily lives, and that is Black men who are hung up on sexism within the Black culture, or white women who are just drowned in racism. Because
Can you give us that
competition.
title and author again one more time?
Yes, the title of the book is They Were Her Property. Lord, who's the author? Stephanie. I finished the book already a few months ago, but it's just one that I think everybody should read twice, really, if they have the opportunity. Let me, I don't want to mess with my browser right now and try and go search for it. You found it? Okay, good.
Yeah.
So, but They Were Her Property specifically talks about the extraordinary detailed amount that white women were not only involved in, but ran just excessive aspects of the coordination of slavery. I'm going to let that sit where it hit. I use the word coordination on purpose. It is more than just perpetuating. It is not hypothetical. It was not only social. It was not just in their sitting parlors and at their lunches. I'm talking about on paper. I'm talking about inheritance. I'm talking about money. I am talking about arranging all of the political meetings that made sure laws were passed to protect, like owning their own slaves, giving of slaves as quote unquote gifts from one to another as late, like, because there's this concept, and anybody who knows me knows like I'm an aggressive feminist, so this is not about feminism. There's this concept outside of the Black community that because certain people who weren't Black were female, that they could not have possibly participated in perpetuating racism, and there could not possibly be a greater fallacy for this country and our population. That book is long and it is full, and for those who are interested in details, it is absolutely necessary. I mean, it's necessary. And so for our friends who suffer or deal with the burden, I don't want to say suffer because the suffering comes from, society, not for you. If you are neurodivergent, if you're dyslexic, any of those things, and you have access to Audible, it's on Audible. Highly recommend, whatever way you can get a hold of it. So that's a big one. The second one is That the Blood Stay Pure, and that's by Erika Coleman. She is a really Sheree, I'm surprised. Don't you know her? This is a really well-known Indigenous Black author from Harvard.
Yep.
Yeah, I was like, I know you know who this is. She's man, that book, I would sleep with that book like it's the Bible. Like I have a really special. That is about the participation and witnessing and very complex interaction between the native tribes, but specifically the 5 nations, the quote unquote 5 civilized tribes. And if you don't know what that means, right, you know what I'm getting into, right? Like we don't have time for that on this podcast, but look up 5 civilized tribes. Like I kind of say that tongue in cheek because even the history behind that name, which is somewhat sarcastic on the part of the white government that gave it to them, and what happened with their interaction with freed slaves, especially, and their interaction with the perpetuation of slavery after the French and Indian War is also extremely important. I see you smiling because I know like you feel seen right now. But this is my history too, sis. I told you at the beginning. And I know some people just be like, I had an Indian grandmother too. And they probably did. But like, this is, I grew up on this. This is my bread and butter, Like this is a real part of my identity. So that's another part because I feel like you were saying in the beginning, Cara, that understanding the layers and the interaction between other people who have different types of oppression, but still participated in, it's something about the hierarchical pyramid mentality. I intentionally don't use totem pole because I hate what that implies. So it's the pyramid scheme mentality of like, well, somebody's on top of me, so I got to be on top of somebody else, and that completely infected us as a society, and it infected the natives, which is like the natives who survived because of all the trauma they had been through. And it came as an infection already with the white women who got here. Also different conversation, right? So those are the 2 books I would suggest for that. The other part is, I would say, if you're interested in reading historical fiction, read it by Black writers. It is not the same. Like, don't be reading that Scarlett O'Hara mess. Like, that is don't read oppressors telling their own stories about how they oppress people. You know what I'm saying? So like right now, my favorite historical fiction book, there's many, but I'm just talking about the ones that I'm reading so many books, but these 3 books, I have picked them up and put them down and picked them back up constantly for the last year. And so Sadika Johnson, she wrote The Yellow Wife, and it's the story of I hate this term, it means terrible things, but she uses the term because that was the legal term used at the time, mulatto girl, and the abuse that she deals with specifically from her quote unquote master's wife, who is not her mother, what happens to her mother, who bore her obviously out of a relationship with that man, and then her own relationship. So her relationship, I'm giving some things away, but I'm trust me, the story is so rich, it won't do anything for you to know this. So that's her history. That's from where she descends. And when you're thinking about epigenetics, like think about the circumstances that so many of us as Black women, like, don't be mixed. You know what I'm saying? like I am, or I know you are. Like, most of us are, honestly. They think that the genetic makeup of anybody who's ADOS is at a minimum 20% not Black in the United States, because there's no way that you got this far if your family's been here for over 100 years and somebody else wasn't involved. Whether your grandmother's one of them to be or not is somewhat irrelevant. Like, unfortunately, that's part of what happened to us. So she is loved and beloved in the story by the most handsome, quote, and smartest field hand who is being sexually abused. I'm being very, very delicate right now. Sexually abused by the quote unquote mistress of the household. Lord have mercy. Like, these are things that we know, but it has been a completely revolutionary experience reading it out of the hands of a Black femme author. I highly recommend, because she did so much research. You know what I mean? And so I'm just going to put those things out there, because we're going to be glossing over really large concepts in the next like 15 minutes. But for the sake of your identity, if you are a Black person or an Indigenous person in any regard, please invest. And it doesn't have to be books. Like, maybe you're not a bookworm. I respect that. But like, invest in art that is made and created by people who originate from the identities that you have. It's a very different way of getting in touch with your background. With that said, these things are really vivid in my mind right now, not just from an academic standpoint, but from a personal standpoint. because I've been reading these books, and then, you know, while I'm reading, I'm the type of person that if I see something, if it's a law, if it's a real person's name, if it's a politician, I'm gonna look them up. That's what Google is for. So like, I've had a transformative experience for getting back into colorism. Like, here's where colorism and caste and the church intersect for me in a way that I don't ever think I'll be able to forgive Christianity in this country for, like, under any circumstance. I don't care what anybody thinks about that. Like, as far as I'm concerned, God was wide awake when all this stuff was happening. So, I mean, wasn't he? He's supposed to be. That's what they say. So he saw it happen. And there's one or two options. Either he's going to take all his mercy and grace, like if he's the God he says he is and he's as big as he says he is, if he sees Aaliyah's like, I'm never going to quit the church ever again, ever. He's going to be like, I get that. I saw what they did. I understand. Like, I'll find another way to talk to you. It's cool. You don't have to call yourself that or believe that or anything. Well, you know, I'll still talk to you. I'll find you. He's either going to do that or he's not going to let me into heaven, in which case I don't want to be there because somebody master up in there anyway. Like, I just...
Big fact.
Listen. Those are the options, and I am incredibly at peace with both. Like, I really know where I stand. We are good.
I will take a slow boat, and you know, it says every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess. No, I will not. You'll be getting. I will be flipping the bird. I will take my slow boat, but I will be flipping the bird because that's not how this is supposed to work, right?
I don't, and I don't care what anybody says about that.
No,
like, I don't say that tongue in cheek. I'm for serious. You cannot tell me that it's the God that you claim for this God to be in the same tongue that you look at me and say, and he's also the one responsible for this genocide so that you could get to know him. I'm sorry, he's an abusive psycho. We don't play that. We're not doing that. So
right. And let me just plug right there. Like, you know, people may take offense to that, but you really have to run the logic through. Whatever you believe, whatever you say is truth or whatever else, you have to run that through to what it implies about God.
Exactly.
And if what you believe, if you run that logic through, ultimately has to say something about God that doesn't make sense, or that, you know, does not recommend God as being something that anybody wants anything to do with, then you probably, for me, it makes sense to reevaluate the belief. And I think that there's a stark contrast between who God actually is and who people say God is. And if they're, and you have to think about what you are relying on God to be. Absolutely. In justifying your beliefs. If I believe that God is all knowing, all loving, all powerful, and God, you know, actually gives a crap about us, and this wasn't some sick psycho experiment or simulation or whatever gone wrong, then my beliefs need to be a reflection of that. And if your beliefs are not a reflection of that, instead of trying to fit God into some sort of narrative that works for justifying your beliefs, maybe just consider reevaluating your beliefs, because people get it wrong all the time. And it's okay to say that this interpretation is crazy. It doesn't, it cannot be reconciled with who God is supposed to be. And so I reject it. It's okay to do that. All of us on this panel do that. All the time.
All of that is absolutely. All of that is important, because if you don't do that, then that's literally the equivalent of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You have to take the baby out of the bathwater. I mean, you don't have to, but I would hope that you wouldn't want to just throw the baby out with the bathwater. But a lot of people throw God away because they're like, if I can't have God in this prepackaged perception of how Christianity has presented God, then there is no God. There is no
Or
God.
you're taking
You know?
Christianity's word for it. I want
Yes.
nothing to do with
Exactly.
God because I'm
Yes.
assuming that
That's right.
I'm relying on all this stuff to be true.
Yep.
It's like it's because it's the same thing. Either way, you're relying on these false narratives to be true. And so for me, it's like, and I think it speaks for all of us. Like, no, the narrative is just wrong, and
Yeah.
it doesn't
Right.
even make sense.
No.
think
Like God is either a psycho or God is a benevolent, loving God who actually makes sense
Can't be
and
both.
isn't crazy. Like there is no
There's
in between. And I personally, I also need a God who's smarter than me.
Yeah.
Hello.
If I can figure it out, if it's real cut and dry and easy and whatever else, like I would not assume or presume that I am smarter than an infinite being. And so
Right.
if it
That's a very
sounds
limited
dumb to me,
infinite. If I can figure it
right.
out, that's a very limited
And if it sounds
infinite.
dumb to me, chances are it came from somebody and not something.
Yeah.
Right.
If
'cause
it sounds dumb, it's probably because somebody over here came up with it and they were dumb.
yeah.
And I'm not taking their word for it.
That's so true though, but that's a very small infinite. If I can conceive it in my mind, me being a finite being, then that's a very small measure of infinite
Period.
nature. It just is. And like when you sit back, and like Leah touched bases on this several times, and I want you guys to get this. It doesn't just apply to this topic. Do your own research. Please get acquainted with reading books, finding research for yourself,
Girl.
understanding for yourself, not just listening to even people just like us, listening to your own thought, your own inclinations, your own drive, your own thing that is I wonder about this, I wonder about that. Those intuitive nudges are not put there for no reason at all.
And bounce that off
Yeah.
of people who challenge you.
Yes.
Right? Like because that's
The
important.
truth can
Like
stand up against criticism.
right. But
all
people
day long.
but people who know what they're talking about to be able to challenge you, right? Like
Yeah.
the conversations I can have with Leah, for example, about, the things we're talking about today are going to be different than the conversations I would be able to have about the same topic with someone who is not as educated. And it's not because their opinion is stupid or wrong automatically because they're not as well versed in the subject area, but it's because she's put in the work. And so I feel like this is something I have learned. There's room to, debate and have conversations with, random people about things or whatever, but you need people whose opinions you respect because you know that they've put in the work and who are able to challenge you in a way where you learn something. Because
You
if
need
nothing
people
else,
who are humble. I need people who know their
yes,
limitations, my nigga. Like,
yes.
I'm not getting into no debate about quantum physics. Your ass didn't pass health sciences in high school. No, your damn lit. Like, you know how I feel about this, Cara. Like,
Yes.
you not being a specialist in my area doesn't make you stupid, but you trying to argue with me about my specialty when you've never taken a class does make you stupid. Like, please perceive the difference.
Yeah, and it is about that humility. Like we're all trying to learn. Nobody's perfect. We all have our limitations, and that's fair and that's fine. But we need
You don't
to
see
be
me arguing with nobody about
right.
about chemical engineering.
Right.
Because
We
I
need
haven't taken a chemistry class in 20 years, Like, I know my limits. What's wrong with you?
and I think it's understanding those limits that gives us the compassion and the empathy for each other.
Yes.
And it gives us a better conception of God. Because once I realize that I'm limited and everybody else around me is limited and we're all trying to figure it out and nobody is better than anybody else, then it puts everybody else's opinions into perspective. And I think what Cherie is saying is really important because at the end of the day, I think it's important to have those conversations and to have a community that you trust in terms of having these conversations. But at the end of the day, the only person who is living your life is you. The only person who is believing what you are believing is you. And you have to be able to be at peace and secure in what you believe and the work that you have done to be able to have any sense of security. You need to be able to put in that work to be able to have that sense of security so that you don't feel threatened by anybody else or swayed by what anybody else is doing.
I just also wanted to add on top of what Leah was just saying, because I feel you. But I feel like a lot of people go into these arguments, because I call them arguments. I don't even call them
When
debates.
you're uninformed, it is an argument.
Because I feel like a lot of people go into these arguments because their pride is hurt. And
Yes.
that's an internal thing that you have to work on. When you have a situation and you're presented with some sort of information that may be foreign to you, or you may feel like that you're not as knowledgeable about a particular situation, and it makes you feel some sort of way, then just as a self-care advocate, that is a trigger, and that is an indicator that you need to work on something on the inside of you, because someone being confident about a particular subject should not elicit such argumentative
Defensiveness.
defense.
Yes.
It shouldn't elicit that. But so often we get into that, you know what I mean? It becomes this whole battle of the bourgeoisie that goes on in the Black culture, who can outwit each other, instead of having a situation to where we can have an honest dialogue, where we can grow with one another. Becomes this whole particular thing. I'm not ever, like Kara just to say, I'm not ever gonna come to Leah about something that she has multiple degrees in and tell her,
I mean, come to me, but like ask me questions if something doesn't make sense.
Exactly.
Don't be coming to me like you can't be right, because I'm gonna ask you why. And if you don't have a real answer, I'm never gonna talk to you again. Like, please don't waste my time.
And that's real. And it's like, at some point you have to understand, and just as you have to understand, it's so important. It's important to have people like Leah in each and every field who has done all the work and done all the things. And it's important to have
say the
other
each and
people
every
who
field
don't.
part again, please, because people don't understand. Like, it's a whole world out there. There's
Yes,
so many. Like, I don't argue about no legal stuff, but I will tag Car in anything. And she'd be like, Leah, I don't even know anything about this. I'm like, I don't care. I'm not a lawyer.
but that's so real. Like, each person has their own particular thing. You do not have to conquer and master it all. Find your thing, find a thing that you're passionate about, and that's your particular thing. But have relationships and collaborate with others who have information about other things, and you be a student in those things. You don't have to be the teacher in every single classroom. No teacher is the teacher in every classroom. I don't care what university that you go to. Every teacher was a student in a different class before they became a teacher, and they're the teacher of their class. You have to take that type of mindset, switch your perspective, understand that it's just as important to have people who are knowledgeable about something and people who are not, because this is the reason why when you're super knowledgeable about something, you have a lot of things figured out in your mind already, because you've been doing this for a long time. So when you're presenting information, this is why I'm assuming why Leah said this earlier on, you forget about certain things, or because you already understand.
Absolutely. That's why I told you guys, you have to ask me questions, because I'm coming from a place of assuming everybody knows so many things already, and that's not fair. It also can make me look as if I'm arrogant, and that's not my intention. It's just that I'm so submerged in this topic, I have forgotten what other people's baseline is, you know? And like, I need people to ask me questions.
But that's exactly why I wanted to say that, because I feel like sometimes people, when they see someone who is very passionate and very astute in their particular field, they feel pompous. They feel like, oh, well, who do they think
they think you're intimidating or conceited or whatever the case may be.
Don't let that be your first don't let that be your first line of defense. You know,
it's okay to feel it, but don't stay there.
Yeah, don't stay there. Even if
can I say that I think being Christian, being raised Christian, encourages people to cultivate an image of rightness rather than a spirit of curiosity, and that's actually where this comes from. Because I can tell you,
I was literally
the only people who approach me like this, right? The only people who approach me like this, regardless of what color or ethnicity they are coming from this background. And I'm like, why are you even trying to be more right than me? First of all, in my field, there isn't a such thing as right. There's only a such thing as how many details do you have and where did you get them from? Like, we are not about rightness. Like, that's not what my field does. And most scientists don't, right? Like, because that's why it's dynamic and it's ever changing. So,
and that's how you leave room for evolution. Like you can't. There is no, once you are right, there is no room for evolution.
No.
And when we're talking about intangibles, when we're talking about spirituality or we're talking about experiences, because that's what this is particularly about, because it's about the Black experience, but it's also about there being levels to that.
Here's
There's
the
levels
crazy
to
part,
it.
though. Even when you get into genetics, when you get into biophysics, there are no right. Everything that everybody has thought was right for every generation has been
Right.
debunked. Science
Right.
is a method for a reason. Medicine is a practice for a reason. There is no end game except for to understand what is happening in front of you to the best of your abilities with whatever knowledge and tools you have. So, like, just as soon as people come at me with a posture of obsession with rightness, I already know this is an argument. And like, this will probably explain why I interact with people the way that I do sometimes. People be like, you already went off on them, because I already knew. And I also like don't have time or interest in arguing with you. You want to fight with me? I know how to fight. Like, just because I went to a university, I also came from the hood. You want to fight with me? I'll give you a fight. I know.
And
what to
nobody
do with
owes
that.
you an argument. Nobody owes you an
Right.
argument. Like
Shuri,
and
you're laughing at me,
and that's
but
where
you know
that
I'm serious.
and I think that's where that, it comes off as being bougie or arrogant or whatever, like, oh, you only want to talk to people who agree with you. And it's like, no.
I
I
only
know
want to
my
talk to people
I know
who
my
can
limitations.
add to,
Right.
no, I only want to
We
talk to people who can add to what I am doing, and you are not here to do that.
Right.
You're here to take away.
You're
Please
right.
leave
You're
my
here to be right.
presence.
You're here to be right.
And I
Right.
think that is so important when you're sitting back and you're talking about this topic in particular, when you're talking about trying to understand from a different perspective. The reason why it's so hard, or why things seem so heavy when we're talking about the Black female perspective, is because there are so many people in the main space who feel like that their understanding of our perspective is so right. And
Right.
anyone
And
else
say that
speaking
again.
out of,
Their understanding with complete lack of
oh
experience.
child, I just really want y'all
Girl.
to get that so bad. Like, they just believe that it's just so right. And that a Black woman speaking, writing, educating about our experience has to be phallicized in some sort, has to be wrong. It
Woo!
can't be right.
Repeat that.
They will hit you with the, where are your sources? I don't know. Maybe my lived experience is my source.
But girl, even if you give them sources, it's not, nigga, you ain't read them. Like, don't be coming at me. And again, like, I know I don't sound academic right now, but I don't care. I'm serious. When I say, like, I need to humanize this for people. And I also feel like I've learned, first of all, I'm exhausted, y'all. I've been a mom for 10 years. These people are eating at my brain cells. Like, I can only compartmentalize for so long. But the other part that I've learned in my circles is that part of decolonization within academic Black circles is to not try and make ourselves look presentable all the time. And this is a segue into what I'm getting to in the next portion. I don't need to, quote unquote, talk right all the time to prove that I am intelligent. I don't need to, quote unquote, act right or look right, but it's all white. It's all white. It's all white. That's what it is, right?
That.
And so the reason why I do, first of all, if you are Black and you come at me like you from the hood that I was born in, I'm gonna give you the Leah that's from the hood that we were born in. So don't be coming at me like that unless that's the Leah that you want. Like, I don't have time, and I'm not interested in like impressing you. So if that's what you ordered, that's what you're gonna get. That's something everybody should know about me. But the second part is, like, I'm never too smart, I'm never too informed to no longer be myself. And the bottom line is, it doesn't matter how many layers or how many stilettos or how many, I don't even remember the last time I wore stilettos to a meeting, but I used to, because I felt like I had to. I used to press my hair out because I felt like I had to. But none of that took away my internal voice, which sounds like how I'm talking to y'all right now, because that's
facts though, because a lot of people look at intelligence as a way to change who they are, when it should only emphasize. It's like makeup. It's supposed to enhance what is already
what is there. That's right.
It's not supposed to, because I am intelligent now, then I am no longer tied.
Right, I'm whitewashed.
Sort of anything
no, it doesn't work
my
like
heritage.
That.
What?
And plus, like pigeon and ave and all of those things are legitimate. We learned how to communicate with each other this way, not because we didn't know how to speak proper English, but because the people who were oppressing us didn't understand what we were saying. So I'm going to continue to speak in our own, you know what I mean, linguistics. Number one, I'm comfortable there. And also, I have the capacity to express many emotions in very small sentences or just a tut, like sitting somewhere. Every Black woman knows what that sound means.
Or child.
Chat girl,
Child.
like just like, and that's not for me. I'm not putting on. That's me being comfortable. That's me not suppressing myself. I also feel like when I was growing up, I didn't see Black women who were able to be educated and still be Black and be free. And so now I'm in this space that I'm intentionally authentic so that when other women who are my age, you 30 something, you pushing 40, you know, you're whatever you are, and you hear, oh, she's got kids, you know, she's divorced, she got remarried, she's all these things the church told me was going to take me to hell. She's still like on the road to finishing her doctorate. You know, she does all these things in the fancy world, but she can still be herself. And like, she can be educated and still be authentically Black and unashamed. And I feel like that's very important. So when I get on these podcasts, I'm not putting on. Like, anybody who knows me knows I'm not putting on, because if you talk to me outside of academic spaces, this is the lead. Right? But a lot of people who don't know me don't know that. And especially the way that I speak. Oh my God, I was going to send y'all this meme. This is my last little aside before I move into, but what I'm about to talk to involves respectability politics and like the policing of Black women and how the church does that. So kind of an associated segue. But the way that I write is not the way that I speak, and when, at all. Anybody who's written what I write, but I'm a trained writer. Like that's also part of my field. But I'm not going to speak the way that I talk. It takes way too much energy, and I'm just like, I don't have a verbal editor. My mouth moves much faster than my mind, unfortunately. But the meme was this picture of, who was it? It was like, I think it was the president. It was one of the presidents of the United States, and it was like me when I write, and then it was the Tiger King on the other side, and it was like me when I talk, and I was like, I feel like I relate to this so much. But it was good. It was a good practice for us to decolonize ourselves, to understand like the way that you interact with language, especially around your people, especially with when it comes to ethnicity, has nothing to do with your intellectual veracity at all. In fact, they have found, when they have tested, the capacity to code switch is one of the highest indicators of intelligence that there is. The ability to get up on stage and speak in the jargon of your profession and sit down with your girlfriends and speak in Ave, that requires just excessive interaction between the two lobes of your brain that usually take a longer time to communicate with each other. So I want us as Black people to see this as a point of pride. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's a segue into the next part. I see that we have so did somebody ask a question?
Yes, well, Owen, he was speaking in the chat. I mean, Omar, and he made a statement.
Oh, I see that. Yes, I see it.
Yes, I don't know if we can get we can get it all on the screen.
Can. Yeah.
And I think that is awesome. I think that is wonderful.
Yes. Kara says we need to get back on track. We do.
Yeah.
Working on it. All right. Let me go to the next part, because we can also be distracted for a long time. Everybody's good. I can move on to the secondary part.
I was just going to say, yes, Omar, though, it is about freedom, and I think all of us are happier. Yes. Moving away from oppressive systems and everything that comes with that, because again, there's so many levels. But yes, you need to get back on track.
All right, we're going. All right, so without further ado, the next part is discussion of stereotypes that dominated colorism, caste for Black women, ways that the church has reinforced puritanical views of sexuality that are socially destructive and perpetuate that caste. So I'm going to talk about both of these two things together, because for me, they're intertwined. I'm going to let me start off with the basics. I get carried away with details. I'm going to start out with the basics. So caste. Caste is a word that we hear involved in other parts of global society. I'm thinking specifically of Eastern Seaboard, East and South Asian cultures. Anybody who has paid any attention to National Geographic at any point in their life, or has like any just superficial knowledge of anthropology, probably has heard the term caste. In India specifically, I think it's been the most publicized. There were like a whole bunch of documentaries about it in the late 90s, and like for the millennial generation might have heard about castes, where literally, but the castes are arranged by color. It's not just it's very important to note that their caste system is directly built on colorism. And for those who may have missed this in their history classes, the only place that has dealt with as much, to me, this is my assessment, the only place that has dealt with as much violent hands-on oppression as the continent of Africa in terms of just society being crushed by another culture and system is India. India's occupation by Britain, from the beginning of the Silk Road until India gained its independence, right around the Civil Rights Movement, actually, in the United States, was incredible, just in the worst possible ways. And to this day, for my life, I do not understand why it is not discussed more that, like, Britain enacted an entire slave system in India. Like, just because they didn't deport them out of India into Britain to be slave, although they did, like, some households did, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying there wasn't a whole, like, trans-Indian slave system within the country. They enslaved whoever the hell they wanted, and every single white person who was there. It's, if you watch any TV shows, like The Crown covers this in such, it shows how nonchalant and insidious it was, and I think that that's appropriate because for the white people who were there, for the domineering, I don't like to say dominant because that makes it sound like they deserve it, that is false, domineering culture who was there, they dealt with a level of violence and imposition that is, to my knowledge, the only one on the planet, the only occupation that comes close to what happened in Africa and then was transferred to the Americas. But I say that because it's also the only other place on the planet that still deals with residual self-destructive color-based caste. And there's just absolutely no way that that's an accident or a coincidence, right? So I use caste because I want to make it plain. I think we like to separate ourselves from other people's woes because all of us have been, like, infected with the idea of exceptionalism in American culture, but we shouldn't be, because we would be able to tackle colonialism a lot easier if we saw that this was a pattern across the board. So in the United States, colorism was very straightforward. The lighter you were, or quote unquote, the more privileges you have. Let's not use that term. I'm going to say more freedoms, because it's not a privilege as a Black person to be allowed, samples of humanization that everybody should have access to. Right? And this is something that is rather revolutionary that I've spoken to Kara and other people about, in private. I'm going to put it out there. And people can do what they want with it. I know it might be somewhat a jarring concept to deal with, but I want us to stop calling fair-skinned Black people privileged. I don't like that word. The reason is because the way that we use it, it denotes that you have something extra that you don't deserve. That's not what is happening. The lighter you are when you are Black is the more you are humanized. And we need to do it that way because we need to put the fault on white supremacy and people who are perpetuating white supremacy. Because the reason why I say that is because if you look at light-skinned Black people and you say they have privileges, that's like things that you don't need and also don't deserve. I'm sorry, but not being shot by the police is not a privilege. That is part of being a human being. Nobody should have to deal with it.
I also think that was intentionally done. That's all a part of it.
I agree with you.
The whole to create division between
I agree with you
100% and lighter skinned Black people, and
because it has a squabbling over it when the bottom line is
because you're like the man. They're like the man behind. They're the eyes, and
the man behind the curtain.
Doing this, hating each other, not realizing that they're the one that says, "I'm going to give you a little bit more than this one."
Correct.
And now this one's going to hate you because you have more because. And you're like, I don't even know why I got this. I didn't choose the skin,
Right.
So
I agree. People aren't ready for it. And I understand that that's not how it works all in the real world. And that's not what I'm suggesting. I'm saying on a theoretical level, stop calling it that. Like, everybody should be treated this way. This isn't some special extra credit access that light-skinned people have because light skin is better. What is happening is that white people treat each other like human beings, and the further away you are from looking at them is the more they dehumanize you, like talk about it the way that it's happening. You know what I'm saying? Because then all of a sudden, oh, we remember like what the enemy is, and I feel like that's kind of important.
No, that makes so much sense. We've talked about this, and I've been very vocal about my struggles coming to terms with colorism and the language, and how we address all of it. But I think that is a really interesting way to
like hold
articulate it, right?
Instead of concentrating on white people with light skin are treated better. Okay, but let's flip it. People with dark skin are treated worse because white people are more violent towards them. Doesn't that sound a little bit different?
Right. And when you do it that way, it takes the onus for change
and puts it back off
of right. Because and I think amongst women too, there's an aspect of that when in terms of men. I was
going to get into
because there's this competitiveness amongst ourselves, and it's like men are more likely to like you if you have lighter skin. And one, and I'm not going to get too into my personal because I'm not in a space where I'm ready to share this just yet. Right, but I will say that is not. It's not always an advantage. Where some people may think that this is it can expose you to danger that you would not otherwise be exposed to,
right?
If you were considered quote unquote less desirable, and that's
I think when you use the term less accessible. I'm saying that for a reason.
Okay.
The reason why I'm saying less accessible is because I was in a group today. And somebody, first of all, she talked about she's light skinned, she and my same color. Listen, I know I'm not dark, but I'm also not passing. What the hell is the matter with you? Anyway, so like people be so confused. I hate when I see people that's like, you are brown. And they're like, I'm light skinned. We're like, don't be talking for people. You're not even anyway. I think that varies depending on what part of the country you're from. I understand in parts of the deep south, I'm definitely light. People have made that clear. But like in California, I'm not light. I'm a regular brown person. Anyhow. It's true though, right, Cherie? Like it's so relative, and that's colorism.
That's very true because my color is different depending on where I'm at.
Where you are, right?
Yep.
So, and that's the thing about colorism. That's how you know that it's built on white supremacy. Like, how is my value relative to where I am based on how other people around me look? Like, this is only a function of exploitation. So, in that sense, I will say perceived as more accessible to exploit. The reason why I say that is because this woman, she got in this chat. Oh my God. She made this comment. It's a terrible comment. So everybody brace yourselves because it's been bothering me all day. And I was like, I have to bring this up because this goes directly into what we're talking about. She made a bunch of comments, but in the midst of it, we were talking about how colorism does not go both ways and how you don't need to hold anybody who is Black accountable for the system white supremacy has created that changes how they're treated. The only thing you need to hold people accountable for is whether or not they're holding up that system of white supremacy. And I was like, yes, like all the finger snaps, like redirect us to a unified cause. And this was the one sole like ridiculous comment. And in that comment, she said, she basically implied that if you were fairer, you were more likely to get sexually abused than if you were a dark person. And I was like, honey, where? What? You heard me. She said that if you were light-skinned, you were more likely to get raped. And I was like, where do you think the light-skinned people came from after they stopped bringing slaves over from Africa, which they only did for like 15 years and the rest of slavery was 60? Where did all the Black people born in those 60 years come from? What is the matter? Excuse me? And she couldn't answer it. Then she got really angry and like the rest. Then she just left the whole thread. But everybody, like a whole bunch of sociologists and historians came in. I was like, we're not even going to get into the fact that you just claimed that sexual abuse was about attraction, not fucking violence and power. Excuse my French. You'll have to edit that on the podcast. I was so, I was livid. Like, how can you believe this about other people, much less about yourself as a Black woman? Like, we're not even going to touch on how obscene that is, because lots of people who aren't educated in this area have the misconception that abuse is somehow based on attraction instead of complete malevolent violence and power. It has nothing to do with what you look like. It never has anything to do with what you look like. That's always a distraction.
I think it's crazy to even say that at all, because I've heard people say that
it is. It's
abuse has happened. Like that people are less concerned with abuse happening to darker skinned women because
correct.
Darker skinned women are innately appear to be more aggressive and violent and
which
combative.
Means somehow they deserve it. She was implying
so
all of that.
In some way, their skin is an
makes them culpable for what's happening to them.
Makes them culpable of it. You know what I mean?
But
and so it becomes a whole.
She knows how I am. I will make you follow your train all the way to the stupid end of whatever the hell track you built for yourself.
No, and that's
what I'm saying. Get into how stupid that is. Where did the light people come from with your crazy ass? Where did they come from?
Right.
Well, because she's saying dark-skinned women were not getting raped and exploited. Where did the light people get? Where did they come from, honey? Where did they? Who are them?
No.
She was like, no, that's not the point. No, it is the point, actually.
And I want to be clear that I'm not saying that. I was not saying that light-skinned women are more likely to be sexually abused or whatever else.
I'm saying not what you're saying.
No, I'm saying that if the premise someone is relying on is that getting more male attention is always a good thing.
Right, which is false because men, which is for another podcast.
No, it is not.
Right.
And if you're not putting the onus for this disparity on the people who are perpetuating it, then
and
you
benefit from it.
Right. Then you stand to further victimize people and not even realize you're doing it.
Absolutely.
So that was my only point. Like, not
no. I'm agreeing with
that. Was my only point.
I knew that you were not implying that at all. I was saying
I'm just saying for the people I know you know, but for people who are listening,
but for everybody else,
right?
Yes,
that is not what I'm saying. Yeah, because I know I'm light skinned, and people be like, hold on, what?
Nah,
like
we know that's not what you meant.
Colorism is a problem. All of it, top to bottom, is bad. I know that there are probably things that I have benefited from and had no concept of it, but I do not give myself or other people who look like me any sort of privilege or advantage. And that is the way society is built. And we all absolutely have a hand. People who are, I guess, closer in proximity to whiteness do have, in my opinion, a responsibility to use whatever platform that provides to speak to these issues. But we didn't give it to ourselves. And that's the difference between what we experience and white privilege, in my opinion.
I want to talk about that a little bit, just as a dark-skinned sister on this podcast.
I have a question. Do people consider you dark-skinned? I'm sorry. I've been in Africa for a long time. That's why I said straight in the middle.
Yeah, sometimes people consider me dark-skinned. Sometimes people consider me brown skin or copper color. Like it just depends on that's why I was saying it is very relative to where you are. And, it depends on whatever you're around, what you can be considered. But I do have quite a few fair-skinned Black female friends. I have one in particular. Her name is Demonica. Shout out to Demonica. And this colorism thing is a discussion that we have had constantly because she has an affinity for darker skinned individuals. You know what I mean? She loves
lots of light skinned people do. I feel this is genetics trying to balance itself, but that's a different conversation.
but she has this thing to where I remember when we first met, it was like she had this thing to where she really wanted to, like, she felt a personal responsibility for uplifting dark-skinned women, which I thought was beautiful. But then as time go along, it made me very sad because I'm like, no Black woman should ever carry that weight. That's not your job. No one put you in this place because you are light-skinned. Just as bad as it sucks for people who are darker skinned, it sucks just as bad as for light-skinned Black women to feel like that they have some freaking privilege they didn't ask for, or
they're being scapegoated. We need to stay focused on the fact that this comes from white people. And the
Yes,
differences
and
in the
that's why I
treatment
think
comes
that
from
is.
white people. Like, stay
I think
focused on
that
the
is.
origin, people.
Yes, that's why I think it's so important, because like even though you're saying, Cara, like we need to use whatever we have. Yes, I don't mind a person, but I just don't want fair or lighter skinned black people feeling
You
like
don't want
that.
any black people taking responsibility
No,
for
yeah,
white things.
Yes,
no.
because it's not.
And let me clarify what I
Yeah,
mean by that, because that is important. And I do think for myself, I have been very intentional about figuring out what parts of this are mine to carry versus what are not. And what I will say is that what I have noticed that I can do is where a man, for example, may not be as inclined to listen to someone who looks like Cherie about colorism and
That
lived
just lights me up on
experiences.
the inside. But I
Lived
just put that out.
experiences, like not even, we're not even
Right.
talking about like this overarching thing. We're just talking about like, this is my experience. I've been through this, and a man is arguing with somebody who looks like you about, you know, what she been through. And it's wrong, but some people are more inclined to listen to somebody who looks like me. And it's terrible. It's wrong. But if I have the opportunity to articulate what she's saying in a way that this person who's not getting it will be willing to listen to and maybe more
absolutely.
inclined to understand, I do feel like it's my responsibility to do that. If for no other reason, then I feel like it's my responsibility to do that in any arena, not just colorism, but in any arena where I am positioned to speak
Where you have a
to the
platform.
issues, right? Or just to speak
Yeah.
to issues that, you know, this person over here may not be able to articulate, but because if I can put it in a way where somebody can understand it, I'm going to do that regardless. And so if I can do that in the context of colorism, and it's, you know, it's stupid that it's based on what I look like, but if I can do it, I feel like I should do it, because I don't feel like that's a battle that that woman should have to fight on her own. Because for me, that's messed up. Like you're sitting here
I
explaining your
agree.
lived experience, and this person is arguing with you, and like you shouldn't have to deal with that at all. And especially you shouldn't have to deal with that alone. And so as another black woman, if I see that, I feel like, you know, just to know that she's not alone, and that there's somebody, and I think too, to see someone who looks like me validating this experience as it's being invalidated by the person who's really privileged in this situation.
Can
It's like if I can give that you know, just that
Can I give an example of what you're saying right now?
yes.
This is currently right now in the news. So we all, I'm sure most of us kind of know of the struggle of what Serena Williams has been through being a female athlete in the industry.
Ooh, girl.
Recently, Naomi Osaka stepped to the front stage about
I love her.
I love her. Listen
I
to
love
me.
all of them.
Listen,
But
Linda.
man, that's girl stepping
Listen.
into her light. I feel it.
Listen. And so like this whole situation of her stepping up and saying, you know, it's important to respect your self-care and not converse with the media for, you know, while she's trying to prepare for the French Open and going through that whole
Yes,
thing.
I saw that because they
Yes.
harassed the hell out of Serena for the last
And
like decade, man.
and it was like, and then they were kind of upset with her, and they came on with this backhanded like, oh, you know, maybe she was having a bad day. We'll just see how she behaves the next time, and blah blah blah. And it was like this whole like, oh,
I wish y'all could see my face because it looked exactly like ours.
And she's like, no, I'll take the $20,000 fine, and I'll
And
stand
pay
up
it,
for
'cause
other
I can.
athletes. You know, and I think that's a really good example of someone who is fair skinned, who is using their privilege, quote unquote.
Wait a minute, I'm
perceived
confused
privilege.
again. Is she fair skinned? Y'all, I'm always confused about
She's
this
lighter
topic.
than Serena.
She's lighter than
She is
and
lighter
she's
than
mixed.
Serena. Okay.
And she's
Yes.
mixed.
All
yeah,
right.
And she
she's
competes for
considered,
Japan.
Japanese.
That's
so
true.
So
All right.
she's lighter than Serena. So with that being said, you know,
In California, that's not light. Cara knows
we
exactly
know.
what
listen, anybody for me,
Anybody
if
black
you're
is
not as light
black
as me,
good.
you ain't
right,
light
you're not
skinned.
light.
That's
In California,
Right.
light is passing. It's two things at once. There's nothing else.
everybody compared to me is brown. So
Right. I
And
stay
so-
confused. But anyway.
But I think that it's super important to acknowledge people that are willing to do that. You know what I mean? Because that's a whole nother movement within itself also. And I think that That is a very good example of what you're saying, Cara. Because Serena literally went her whole entire life, like there's still well documented interviews of her as a child, and people do you have like belittling her, you know what I mean? And her feeling like that she couldn't speak or say or be the fullness of who she was, because how dare you have the audacity to think that you can do that,
That's
wearing
a
the skin
perfect
that you have,
segue into
you know?
the end of this.
Yes.
I'm trying to stay on track, on time. All right, so I'm gonna give 2 examples that like I had to put these books down. You ever read something or hear something is so upset you have to like remove yourself? It's my own book. I love it, but I had to separate myself from it. I put it in another room. Like it was very visceral. So I'll start with that part about the not being able to speak. So there was a handbook. I hate saying these things out loud, but it needs to be known for people who don't know it. Just like there was a fake slave Bible of a whole bunch of sloughed together things that never went together in any way, shape, or form in the original Bible that was only given to slaves. And that's what every single basis of every Black Christianity is based on that. I would never stop saying that because people need to get it in their head. So along with that, there was a handbook on discipline and rules based upon your caste and where you were on the plantation. We ain't talking about no Willie Lynch letters, okay? That was literally a letter. That letter, if it was real, it really is passed down oral tradition that somebody eventually wrote. That was sort of like a Mark Twain style allegory of the conceptual social separations of caste that were very intentionally done on the plantation. The Willie Lynch letter itself is not real.
Educate,
the concept
sis.
is real.
Educate.
I'm trying to help these people out, like with the small amount of time that I have. It drives me crazy. Anyway, so allegory, look up what that word means. I'm not talking about it right now. All right. So based on a real thing, it's a figurative language. So, but the handbook was something that slave masters had. It was sort of like your little black book, just like gamblers and every other like unseemly level of society had these little rules. And it was something that they would force or demand or require every single overseer to learn. Something else everybody needs to know: overseers were never people born into privilege. When they were white people, they were white, lower level caste immigrants, frequently Germans or Irish. If you don't know the history of German, Irish, and Jewish people being lynched, dragged, and feathered, look it up. I'm not going to talk about it right now, but you need to look it up because they have their own massacres. They have their own shoot downs. They got massively drowned. Am I suggesting it is the same as slavery? Not even in the slightest. I'm saying that if you don't know the depths to which the people who were in control in this country have gone to separate oppressed people into castes, you really, really need to. It will help you understand everything about all of our social dynamics right now. So, overseers had to learn by heart, usually orally, because they weren't supposed to be able to read. They had to learn the rules and regulations of this book. So the way that caste was reinforced on the plantation, the darker you were is the deeper you were into the field. That was for 2 reasons. They figured you were already protected from the sun because you were so damn dark. And also they could whip the hell out of you and it would be more difficult to see. Period. Point blank. That was why. It wasn't because they loved light-skinned people more. It was merely a fact of utility so that they could propagate this image of who they thought they were to the outside, of them being like the goodly master. Now, let's talk about where this concept of the good master comes from. I endeavor you to go to Google and search up good master Bible verse. Search it, those 4 words, and read what it says. No, it's not only going to be in the Old Testament. There's also going to be some in the New Testament. Read every single one and don't just read the one verse. Read the whole context. It's not going to improve it. So there was this concept of like the goodly master. When you read Uncle Tom's Cabin, it gets into these 2, like it's really like good cop, bad cop situation, right? Anyway, within all of these rules, if you were going to get into the house, because that was considered a privilege. Now maybe y'all will understand why I said light-skinned people are not privileged. They are just one step closer to being humanized sometimes. Being a slave in the house was not a damn privilege. You understand me? Because being a slave was not a privilege, okay? Doesn't matter how many times they gaslit it. It was a different type of abuse happening. They did not hit the light-skinned slaves, but they raped them. They did not hit the light-skinned slaves where you could see, but they poisoned their damn food. You know what I'm saying? Like, they did not hit them, but they found ways to psychologically make them crazy. I say this because it sounds like, why would you even mention that? But there is this, the undergirds of our culture always say that the lighter the woman is the more crazy she is. I know y'all have heard this. This is the thing that is perpetuated. But you know where that comes from? That literally comes from women in the house having to endure levels of psychological abuse that you do not want to know about. But if you read these books, you'll be like, it'll give you your own nightmares. You will feel psychologically abused after reading it. Am I suggesting somehow that they did not have more privileges? Yeah, they had prettier clothes in the house. But it wasn't because they loved light-skinned people more. It was because they had to uphold their own propagated image to the outside of what was happening in their damn house. They didn't give a hell about what those slaves were wearing. That was always only about them. It was always only about them. And we always have to keep that in mind. Here's what got me. Besides the Bible verses, besides looking at this book of like requirements of what, so the people in the field, they didn't care what you did. You could live like pigs. So to a certain extent, you could be more free and human sometimes, meaning that you could defecate wherever the hell you wanted and you weren't going to be whipped for it as long as it wasn't on, you know, the master's plate or somewhere else that he wanted to keep clean. You could pee when you felt like it. You could drink out of the stream. You could whatever. That might sound animalistic to you, but if you were working 14 hours in a damn field, you sort of needed that space. You couldn't also have that be policed and still get your job done. And they knew that every decision was made out of utility. It was never, ever, ever, ever for any Black person's comfort. Ever. Like, that needs to really sit with some people. The romanticization of what was happening is so far gone. We are extremely out of touch with the purpose of what was going on at those times. I say that to say Black women who were quote unquote darker, they could sing, they could be loud, they could talk to each other, unless something was going on. Like if there was a slave that had run away, then they would typically not allow any of the slaves in the house or in the field to talk to each other, because the idea was y'all are communicating and you're communicating is becoming unruly, right? So maybe you couldn't talk to the master, but if you were in the field, you didn't see the master. So you could get to a point where you were used to popping off at the mouth at each other, learning how to communicate with one another, with your other fellow comrades in the field with you. But in the house, they used to do really weird shit, like put pins in your damn seat and make you sit on it. And if you stopped smiling during the entire meal, they would starve you for the next 3 days. That's the kind of mess the people in the house were going through. There was no escape. They found a way to make you extremely miserable. So,
I feel like that's something a lot of people never really talk about.
No.
Don't really talk about what goes on in the house. Outside of the rape, they don't really talk about the other
But everybody was getting raped. Let's just be super clear. Everybody was getting raped. The people in the field was getting raped. The people in the house was getting raped. There was no, absolutely not. Everybody was getting raped. You know why? Because they wanted more slaves. And to be frank, they needed to do this to the darker skinned women, because how much difficulty you gonna have a kid that looks like one of my children outside in the field? You can't do that. They weren't raping biracial women to get more slaves. I mean, they were using them.
Also, they were buck breaking men too. So
100%. 100%. And see, the thing was, it wasn't just the men doing that. It was usually the overseers who were tasked with that. We need to also talk about how the overseers, the majority of the time, were Black. So that means they were being butt broken by other Black men. I'm going to let that sit. Yeah, it's disgusting, but it's real. And so a lot of these things where we can't process the resentment that is still undergirded with each other, this is stuff we don't even know about. It's been sitting in our bones for a long time, and it's just very difficult to sift through. But getting into where the church reinforces this, So whenever a slave, two things, whenever a slave did something that went against the code of whatever level of the caste they were in, do you know what was part of every single punishment? Every single punishment. It didn't matter what the punishment was. Sometimes the punishment, but there was humility. Not humility is what they called it. It was humiliation. They would take off your clothes and make you parade around, or they would put you in chains and tie you into a damn pole. A lot of the times they would just, if you were, this didn't usually happen to the women as much unless you were older and they felt like they didn't have any more sexual use for you, and that is they would whip you. The whipping, the vast majority of the time, from birth to death, was mainly the men, because they didn't care what they looked like physically. They couldn't get any babies out of them, you know. And moreover, they could have the men were usually shirtless when they were working. So that served as a reminder, literally, while you were in the field looking at their back about whatever the hell it was you thought you were going to do. Anyhow, during these punishments, they read the damn Bible. They had the pastor, who was almost always some black slave, who would sit on top of this appointment to reinforce, look, one of your own is down. One of your own is drinking the Kool-Aid, mixing it too. So the overseer is beating you. He's black. The pastor is yelling out some stupid Bible verse that probably doesn't even exist from the slave Bible that they made up. He's black. But here's the really weird shit. Like when I looked up the stuff that they would frequently read, it was about good master, good slave, bad slave. It was always the same stuff. But whenever they would read like basically their Hellstone and Brimfire, they always characterize liberation using the verses from Revelation that pertain to the woman who is sexually free. I take significant issue with this, considering the degree to which everything was coordinated in a suffocating manner in terms of slave sexuality. Like, you weren't free to be anything. So if you were constantly characterizing even the concept of freedom with this idea of whoredom, which is tied to unfettered pleasure, do you understand what I'm getting at? You're constantly characterizing literally women's freedom to enjoy themselves and to take part in creation in a way that we are in charge of, that we are intentional about, that we volunteer to do, and that we enjoy as sin. I could have chosen many, many, many examples, but for some reason that stood out for me because I feel like every single concept in the church that is angry about women being free, women speaking freely, women enjoying ourselves, women in any way, shape, or form climbing the quote unquote ranks comes down to that idea of characterizing liberation as whoredom. And I'm gonna, like, I know that's very metaphorical, and I kind of mean for it to be that way because I want people to think about it. The next one is a completely different tangible one, and this one made me physically ill, and I don't think I'll ever, 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 under any circumstances, sit through a communion ever again in my life. Y'all are familiar with the deaconesses and the deacons, but mainly the deaconesses white gloves they're obsessed with. I don't know what kind of church you into, but they're obsessed with these damn gloves.
Oh,
in church,
Lord.
always. I hated, like, they'd always unsettled me. Why do you have to put white gloves on your black hands in order to touch holy things? Like, something bothered me about that so much. Y'all, I had to look this all the way up, and I almost threw my phone out of the window. So that is a practice that has nothing to do with anything biblical. Because in my head, it was like, if it was from something biblical, shouldn't it be like in Leviticus or Exodus or somewhere? I don't see nothing about them not being able to touch stuff somewhere. I mean, you have to clean your damn hands, but like, there's got to be some racism involved if you clean your hands and put on white gloves. I just don't understand this. This doesn't make any sense. It's always unsettled me. Did you know that it has nothing to do with church? And it was actually a rule that was inside one of these stupid, godforsaken, terrible books about how plantations were supposed to be run. All of the house slaves were required to wear white gloves when they touched anything that they were handing to the master, because masters were considered, like the Pope, I'm just going to put this out there, a figurehead on behalf of God. right? That's how they were seen. But that's how it was advertised in church. When you look at all of the verses that they put in the Bible, it had to do with like, this is your master on earth versus your master in heaven. Excuse me? That's really how they were characterizing it. Anyway, this white glove thing was a rule. They used to chop off the house slaves' fingers if they found out that you were touching, unless your hands were in the damn sink with soap on them. If it was outside of that and they were dry, if you were touching your hands on any of their things, anything that the master might touch was considered holy. And so when they did communion, the reason why you wore gloves is because it was that like earthly master, heavenly master shit. And so it wasn't clean if you touched it with your own black ass hands. Girl, I will never take communion again in my life. Not like that.
It just gets deeper and deeper, doesn't it?
It does, in the worst ways. So I'm gonna leave that there, and I don't want people are gonna come at me, challenge me. Don't challenge me, challenge Google. Like, look this shit up. I did. You can. It's not a secret. There's history books full of it. Is it gonna take you a long time? Yes. Is it uncomfortable? Yes. Will you be upset? Probably. But I'm not gonna sit up here and be upset for you doing all the work. If you really want to know, you need to look this stuff up. Like, and also, I've never, ever, ever been in a white church where they wore white gloves. That was one of the biggest things. Like, how come the white people don't wear gloves?
I
That's
never
upsetting, isn't it?
knew that was a difference until now. I'm not even gonna lie.
I see Cara's face and she's like, oh my God.
I never noticed that, but boy.
So I say that for two different reasons. So we have the concept of liberation and pleasure and freedom are always intertwined. And I don't think you can look anywhere in Christendom and see that. When you look at, even, let's take slavery out of it. You want to try to tell me, this isn't about racism. Okay, I don't care. It's still about sex. Like, it's still about sexism. I'm still a woman. Paint me a different color. That doesn't make a difference. When you get into the Salem witch trials, it was always only, like, there was almost never, when you actually try to read through the testaments, because they have them. Listen, they're creepy though. They're creepy. I am not even 1/3 of the way through trying to read them. They just, woo. I feel like my skin's coming off while I'm reading them. If you try to read them, you will find that you never see a description of anything that involves a cult. It's always women who are free, women who don't conform, women who won't follow the rules, and women who are not ashamed of their sexuality. That was the criteria for being a witch. People ask me if I'm a witch now. Absolutely. If that's the criteria, I'm a deeply practicing one, obviously, because I am devoted to all of those things. And if that's all it takes. Or medicine women. There was this idea, and that's where I know, Cherie, that's for you. We're gonna let Cherie get into that. But the healers, the ones who knew how to work the roots, quote unquote, the ones who knew how to take medicine from nature and supposedly talk to God, you show any signs of being a shaman and you're a witch. And it's like, but God created all these. How does that make me a witch? Lord have mercy.
Ooh, Leah.
And then,
Leah.
I know that's that's for you. I'm leaving that segue for sure. I see her. She's over there. But it's true.
Maybe that can be our topic for next week.
Absolutely. So I will say the church has always reinforced all of these ideas. Number one, the church stands as this church is the spiritual reinforcing authority for respectability politics. The church is the one that tells you that doing anything that involves your own pleasure is wrong. The church is the one that tells you if you were trying to liberate yourself from your womanly duties of bearing children and pleasing your husband, you're going to hell. And like, the church is basically operating as a conduit between white supremacy and sexism in the conformity of the Black femme population. And it always has. It always has. Now, we can have the whole Paul conversation, but first of all, I don't worship Paul, all right? If I'm going to choose a deity to worship, it's going to be Christ. And he didn't say any of the things Paul said. As far as I'm concerned, Paul can have his own Bible. The people who love Paul that much, they can go worship Paul. I'm sure.
But isn't that what the New Testament is, though?
It is, and I said what I meant. I said what I meant, though. I said what I meant.
Just throwing that out there.
Do you hear me? Like, I don't worship Paul. That was his interpretation. He's a man. He's a disciple. I don't care what anybody says about that. Also, it's been, I don't know how many thousands of years and how many times we've redone this book. Like, you know how I feel about this. It doesn't, know where you put it am I going to hinge myself having a miserable life based on Paul, who himself was struggling with his own sexuality. He's going to struggle alone. I'm not joining him in that. All right.
And you cannot. And it's like, if you think about this, as these people are just people.
Right.
There's no logical reason to take everything yes,
they
and
say.
And there's no logical reason to take everything that they said as being universally applicable when
Absolutely.
they couldn't have even some they couldn't have even come to a fraction of a conception of what the world is like today. Like they did not conceive of the world in 2021 and the way society would change and the way life would be lived. And so I don't see any reason to not take that cultural context into consideration. And I also don't see any reason to believe that God would not have that as well. Like why God would give something to people
we talked about
that
Rahab
God knew
week,
would not always be
relevant?
applicable moving.
But I don't think it was relevant then. We talked about Rahab last week. I'm serious. We talked about Rahab last week. We talked about Ruth. There's so many examples of that not being true. The way Abigail ends up, Queen Abigail, the way Abigail ends up marrying David is because she prays for her husband to die. And then God is like, you know what? I'll like him anyway. And he does. Like, under no circumstances.
And Tamar, can we get into Tamar?
Hello? But you understand what I'm saying? And under no, whenever you look at women in the Bible, the prophetesses directly interacting with God, there is no evidence that how these men saw these women is how God saw these women under no circumstances. Right. And there's no point which Jesus interacts with women that we have documented that would in any way, shape, or form enforce or underscore that he saw them the same way that the earthly men did either. So I don't care what the disciples wrote about women. They were also men who were probably sexist and were not God. Like,
and they were socialized in a society that viewed women as property.
Correct.
And if you think that that's not going to affect them, like, come on.
Or us. So that's my answer. And, to me, it all goes back to the same thing. Like, I have enough. If I was going to take the Bible alone and believe it to be in literal, figurative, metaphorical, allegorical, satirical, it doesn't matter. Put any application that you desire. I still don't have evidence. In fact, all I see is evidence to the contrary. I see a clear distinction between, like, every time a woman in the Bible is raped or taken advantage of, and she's like, please spare me this terrible man. You know what she gets? An abortion from God. Like, there are no circumstances, it's the truth. Like, there's no circumstances where I see women directly intervening with God that it ever lines up with the treatment or view of the men at the time. And I don't think that's an accident. I think that's a message that people are intentionally ignoring. And I will never be part of a church that continues to ignore it. It's very clear across the entire Bible how you don't get it for 2,000 years. What do you need? So all of those things together, that part, just when we're looking at the theological portion, when you compare that to how it was used and necessitated to reinforce the breeding and rape and exploitation of Black women in order to prop up the worst, most genocidal system of slavery that has been known to man in the modern age in the last 1,000 years. Under what circumstances can you convince me that the church is anything other than like an abuse enabler for Black women? It just, you can't. And other people, like, if you feel happy devoting your life to a system that's designed to suck everything out of you, I can't tell you not to do that. Like, I don't know your story, and maybe that's not your experience. And I respect people who are getting something out of it, but I don't respect people who think that because I refuse to conform, that I'm challenging your peace. Well, good. Maybe that should tell you something. Maybe the same God who was talking to women throughout the entire Bible, telling them something different than the men who were around them, is also trying to talk to you by showing you an alternative means of interacting with the divine that does not involve people exploiting you for the sake of their own glory. Like, I don't know. That's my ending thought.
And we talked about this last week, though. Like, if that is your reaction, unpacking
Right.
where this fear or defensiveness of someone rejecting what you have decided is true comes from. Like, why, if someone is saying,
Why does this
you
threaten
know,
me?
if this works for you, do what you do, but that's not what I believe about God. It's not a reflection of what I believe about God, and it's not
Right.
a reflection of what I believe God wants for me. You have to ask yourself why, like why you would feel a way about that, and where that would come from. And I think, you know, when we do unpack it, there's messaging behind that. There's
Right.
messaging that tells you that if you reject what these people have decided as truth, then you're essentially rejecting God, because their truth is from God, according to them. And
Can
there
I
is
touch on
no,
something else actually now that this came to me, and I don't think this is accidental. It's in line with what you're saying, but if I don't say it now, I forget. And it was bugging me because you and I specifically have been looking at all of these threads about men wanting to be involved in women's rights. God, is it Isaiah? No, it's Hosea. Okay. So in Hosea, he sleeps with this woman. What is she? Moabitess? I don't remember. Anyway, Moabitess, Edomitess. She's one of Assyrian, something like that. She's not Assyrian. I think she's Moabite. Anyway, it doesn't matter. You can look it up yourself. It's relevant. The point is she is not Jewish. And he has this whole thing where he has to marry like a woman of whoredom, or I don't remember the specifics. You can look at it. It's been over a year since I read it. But I just realized, because remember how I was pointing out, like when women ask God for justice directly in the Bible and they cry out to him for their distress, and it doesn't matter which direction. When women who have been infertile cry out to God for a child, they get one. When women who have been raped and abused cry out to God to be relieved of a child, they are relieved in some way, shape, or form. But when men put their little cucumbers in every goddamn salad that they see and they cry out for whatever desire they want, they never get it. From Solomon to Hosea. Like, I almost feel like I want to make a Venn diagram about this. But because Solomon prays the whole time, please, right? He has, please spare the boy. God's like, absolutely not. And you could tell Bathsheba's not upset because it says she mourns and then like she went about her damn business. Why would she want to bear that baby?
oh wait, you're talking about David.
I am. I'm talking about, sorry,
Okay.
I'm talking about David, not Solomon. Solomon is their son. Yes, I'm tired. Yeah, no. Bathsheba. So in that end, the woman gets what is justice for her. Likewise, in Hosea, Hosea begs and pleads. He doesn't just beg and plead. He begs and pleads, and then he gets mad at God and decides he don't want nothing to do with God because every time he sleeps with this woman, please God, I don't want kids with this woman. And God's like, well, you slept with her, so you getting kids with this woman, right? And like the woman is happy, and she even implores him. Well, she's happy in the beginning. These are your kids. You know, why are you acting like you don't know them? All this other stuff. Every time he sleeps with her and he prays to not have a baby, he gets a damn baby. Every time men rape a woman or they do something else that the woman did not ask for and they pray to keep the baby, no baby. And it's literally the exact, I feel like this is such a direct response to what God believes about the sanctity of the capacity to create in the female body. And I wonder why it's never been pointed. I don't wonder why, I'm being sarcastic, but I wonder why it's never been pointed out this way. Like, there is no point where God or a representative of God, a reincarnation of God, interacts with women where God does not lift up women in every aspect. It is only the other people who aren't God who are constantly making these snide remarks about what women should be doing. But then in God's personal interactions with women, that's never what happens. And I feel like in our experience as Black Christians, or those who were raised as Black Christians in the American church, we're dealing with the same detour when it comes to whiteness, just consumption of Christianity, right? And what it has turned it into. And we need to understand that what whiteness told us is our religion is actually our destruction. And I think it's going to be very hard for us to undo the epigenetic damage where we learned early on that being complicit, being cooperative with what was being forced down our throats was necessary for our survival, but it was necessary for our survival of them, not our survival in the spiritual world, not our flourishing with God. The two things are actually in opposition. And so many black folks are struggling with this right now. You know, I shouldn't say that. I think our generation is perhaps far enough removed. You know, I always used to misinterpret this curse in the Bible of the sins of your forefathers will be felt unto the third and fourth generation. You know, we're like in the fourth generation now. And I don't think it's accidental that like we are starting to be able to shake this off. For all we know, from an epigenetic standpoint, that's as far as this mitochondrial like mutation is passed down. Because I see so many people in our generation between the ages of 30 and 50 that are like, man, this mess doesn't make any sense. You know, there just seems to be this collective awakening and questioning, and I'm glad for it. But I think in the end, I am not in any way, shape, or form saying that our ancestors should be demonized. Like, I'm also at a point that if I got to heaven and I didn't see every single slave that died under that system there, that I don't want to be there. I know that's a heavy statement, but I'm really serious about it. And like God and I have had a conversation. And like my mom was like, how could you not want to be in heaven? I said what I said. If I get to heaven and I see that the slaves who could barely breathe in the system that they were in did not make it, I don't care what tribe they were from. I don't care what kind of bones they were throwing. I don't care what occult they were worshiping. If God's mercy passes all peace and understanding, every single one of them better be there. Just because of what they went through. If they're not there, I don't want to be there. I'm not interested in a God who is not saving them. I'm just not. You know, and so like there's so many things that I've come to, but the reason why I can have these conversations on a spiritual level is because I've taken it personally that God is bigger than any human's concept of him. So rather than me accepting everything that's been pushed down my throat for generations, I'm taking the logical route. And because for me, as a scientist, God created science also. So I don't think he's going to do things that don't make sense. And just because the humans that came before us couldn't make sense of him does not mean that what God is doing himself on a level that we don't understand does not make sense, right? So many times that phrase has been used to excuse abuse, but I think it should be used to challenge abuse.
I agree. I agree 100%. And we talked about this last week. I think it's the same thing this week. You have to, like, I mean, you don't have to do anything, but I think that there's value in, you know, unpacking and doing, being cognizant of the fact that there are levels and not stopping at a level that's comfortable. You have to dig into
Absolutely.
the parts that are uncomfortable and able, if nothing else, to land in a place where you can be secure in what you believe and why. Because if you can't, if you're too afraid to dig into the parts of your belief system that may challenge you, that may fly in the face of what you've been willing to accept or what you've been taught or whatever else, and if you're not willing to understand where all of this stuff comes from, then you're never, just for yourself, you're never going to be able to get to a place of real spiritual security because your foundation is going to be shaky. Because
it's on other people's assumptions and other people's adaptations, and that doesn't serve anybody's
but like
spiritual growth.
You don't even know what they are, right? Like it's one thing if you know what it is and you're comfortable with relying on it for whatever reason. It's something else entirely if you don't even know where all this stuff is coming from. Like you were talking, Leah, about the white glove thing. You know, like who's even paying attention to the fact that deaconesses are wearing white gloves during communion or something like that, right? But when it matters. The reality is that it matters.
My weird OCD ass.
But it matters because of where it comes from.
It
matters because of where it comes
from.
from.
And nobody has ever asked.
Right. And you're not.
I remember asking as a child, and my mom was like, well, you do that to make sure that everything stays clean. But then I was like, but when you wash your hands are clean. Why do you need an extra layer of gloves? I was like 10, and she was like, no, because gloves. Like, she couldn't give me an answer. And I was like, okay, so why don't they wear medical gloves if that's the concern? Like, these are lace gloves. They're not protecting anything from anybody. And she was like, no, you do it to keep things pure. I mean, she wasn't wrong, but she didn't look into, you know what I'm saying? Like, what did pure mean? It's terrible. But I think this is also, and this is for a different conversation, but this is where neurodivergence is important. Like, there's some of us who our minds are built to nitpick. Should that be applied to our relationships? Probably not. But should it be applied to history? Absolutely. There's certain things we're finding out about science and history and politics that we would never know if it weren't for the people who questioned and nitpicked every single detail put in front of them. You know what I mean? And so, like, just in general, we need to stop criminalizing people who don't comply with a normality that was created by an oppressor. That's what all of this comes down to for me.
I agree. And I think that that's probably a good place to end things. So I appreciate you, Leah, for taking the time just to educate us. I have actually definitely learned some things that I hadn't thought about. Um, and I hope that the same can be true for the people who have listened today and will listen in the future. Um, yeah, just there's so much. There's so many layers. If nothing else, I hope that people take away from this conversation that there are so many layers to everything that has gotten us as individuals and as Black people and as a country and just as humanity. There's so much that has gotten us to the point where we are now. And I think making sense of who you are and where you fit into the world as it is today demands being very intentional about everything that has happened, good and bad, to get you to the place that you are today. And just not being lazy about it. And I'm hesitant. I don't want to call anyone lazy, and I hope that that's not offensive, but I think that that's what it ultimately boils down to. Like, it's too hard, it's too scary, to unpack everything, and all of those things are true, but you have to do the work. And everything that you are and what you do and how you view the world and interact with the people around you, it depends on what you believe or what you don't believe. And for me, I think that that's the most important
Absolutely.
thing to be intentional about. If you're not intentional about anything else, that's something that you should be intentional about, because everything else about your life, is impacted in one way or another by the things that you hold true and dear. And so do the work. And if you do the work and you know where your beliefs come from fundamentally and you still agree with them or whatever else, fine. But if not, like, it's okay. And I think that that's what we're here to say. Like, it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to push boundaries. It's okay to take in new information and come to the realization, like, oh, what I thought or what I believed is trash. And it's not great. And I'm gonna move on to something that actually fits who I am and actually works for me. It's okay. And I think, and I honestly think that that is something that is almost bound to happen, when you are brave enough to take the journey to challenge what you think you know, and to come into a better understanding of just how much there is out there that you don't know. So yeah, we will be back next week. Thank you all for tuning in. As always, we love you, and we'll see you again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.